These people have mastered the art of performance on the platform and created a persona of what people think those people are really like. People behind closed doors in the staff, people who have direct reports to these people or who encounter these people, will tell you that they had some very tough situations. They were abused, they were insulted, they were humiliated, and they put up with it because they loved being at these churches. They put up with it in part because they've been gaslighted by these pastors into thinking that, well, he's probably right and I'm probably wrong. Only the people behind closed doors know what some of these pastors are like.
Hey, welcome to the Reintegrate podcast. I'm Bob Robinson and my co-host is Brendan Romigh. I've experienced it. Brendan is now experiencing it. Most likely you've experienced it. You think your church is a wonderful community led by godly pastors, but then you see the senior pastor abuses power, or you witness spiritual abuse, not to mention the cases of sexual abuse that are making headlines. This happens in churches that have allowed for a culture of toxicity. To resist toxicity, we need to restore goodness in our churches. The Hebrew word translated good is tov. Scot McKnight and his daughter Laura Barringer have written a book titled A Church Called Tov, Forming a Goodness Culture that Resists Abuses and Power and Promotes Healing. Today's guest is Scot McKnight, who is a New Testament scholar, historian of early Christianity, and theologian. I first met Scot when I attended Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in the 1990s, where he taught New Testament. We later reconnected in the mid-2000s when we both launched blogs at about the same time. The blog Scot launched was called Jesus Creed, after the title of his excellent book. And I launched a blog called Vanguard Church, named after the church that a group and I had planted. We would commiserate over how to blog and what was called back then the emerging church. Jesus Creed had a huge following and continues to be one of the most popular Christian blogs. It's now housed at christianitytoday.com. Scot has continued to be a friend and mentor. He is currently professor of New Testament at Northern Seminary in Lisle, Illinois. Here's our interview with Scot McKnight.
Look at you, Bob. You look like Rush Limbaugh sitting there with all that equipment.
There you go. You could have chosen somebody else, but thanks, I guess. So, Scot, I personally myself experience a toxic culture in a church that I worked at right out of seminary. My first pastoral position was in an independent, non-denominational church. It was in a consortium of other churches that were planted by the mother church, but there was no accountability structure within that. So the pastor was given complete control without any accountability. This was how the Constitution was actually set up. No multiple elders, just one elder, one man who is the grand shepherd of the flock, and all the staff were hired and fired by him. We were solely accountable to the senior pastor, but the senior pastor was accountable to, guess how many people? No one.
Yeah.
So, so this particular pastor, he was weak and he succumbed to the narcissism that this kind of structure breeds. He was always fearful of people, usurping his power, suspicious of people in the congregation, especially his staff. So as I read this book, I see my experience at this church on just about every page. And I cannot help but scream, Scot, why didn't you write this back in 1997?
Yeah, that's right. But I'm sorry, Bob. I mean, it's traumatizing. And a lot of people never quite get over it. I mean, the number of stories that Laura and I have heard is outlandish. We get 3 to 5 emails a week of people telling us their stories of trauma, of abuse. It's all power abuse. We almost never hear a story of sexual abuse. Mm-hmm. They go to other sources for that sort of story, but there's a sickness, and it's probably always been the case,
obviously you and Maura went to Willow Creek and you saw a lot of the issues behind the Bill Hybels thing, and some of that was sexual, but in reality, it was really power, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, I talked to a pastor the other day who said that he had come into a church where they had experienced, there was a story of sexual abuse, and they fired the pastor over it right away. I mean, they did the right thing. Well, he said, when I got in there, I realized that the problem in this church was not sexual abuse, it was power abuse. And he said, the leadership, the staff are filled with traumatized people. So it's far too common. I think what I've noticed, Bob, is that narcissists find positions where they can exploit power and control and feel a sense of grandiosity. And so I think we're going to always have these sorts of pastors if we continue having the sorts of churches we have, where power comes with the territory.
So, Scott, I'm wondering, that narcissism, because that's something you talk a lot about in the book too.
Yeah.
Just narcissistic personality traits and how a lot of churches are structured to enable that, right?
Yeah.
Including a situation that my church is experiencing right now. I attend a mega church, and I love going there. They preach the gospel. They have a fantastic youth program that I like being a part of. But we had a similar situation where the campus I go to, that's a branch, had our pastor basically get fired without warning by the head pastor over all the branches. The pastor of our branch wasn't fired for any allegations of wrongdoing or indiscretion or anything like that, So it's something that's resonating close to home with me right now, as our church is grappling with that, and we're realizing that our church is structured the exact same way as the church, that Bob kind of had his trauma at, where there is not an elder board. There's not direct accountability over the senior pastor. Our church actually our trustees had to call an emergency constitutional meeting, and they're currently trying to investigate and figure out how to fix this mess, because what's going to happen if they don't handle it very delicately is our campus is going to hemorrhage an immense amount of people, because our pastor, who everyone loves, may or may not get let go.
Yeah.
What it's currently looking like is it's because of insecurity of the guy above him.
Yeah. Yeah.
And obviously it's hard to know, right? Because we can't know people's hearts at the end of the day. That's God.
Yeah.
How would you describe the hearts of a lot of these pastors who all exhibit very similar patterns of narcissistic behavior? I mean, like, how much of what they're doing in ministry is authentic? How much of it isn't? How can you tell if you see someone going on that narcissistic trajectory? I mean, like, what's really, I don't know.
Well, one of the things that we have to admit is people respond to the persona on the platform on Sundays, and they import their perceptions onto that person and begin to believe in that person and trust that person, though they don't have a clue what that person is like behind closed doors and behind the curtain. So they're responding to someone they trust as a servant of God, as a mediator of the gospel, and they're responding in good faith to God, and their lives are transformed. They're growing in the faith. I mean, all these things are happening in these churches because on the platform, that pastor knows how to perform what needs to be done to move people, to explain the Bible, etc. So, if you were just to write the sermons out of some of these corrupted pastors, even James McDonald, who's a very, very authoritative type guy, or Bill Hybels, and you didn't know who was saying it, you would look at these messages and you would say, I can see why people respond to this. And I know hundreds of people at Willow Creek who responded to the gospel, whose lives were changed, who grew in the faith because of of the messages that were being preached. So let's realize that these people have mastered the art of performance on the platform and created a persona of what people think those people are really like. So I start with that. People behind closed doors in the staff, people in, let's say, who have direct reports to these people or who encounter these people will tell you that they had some very tough situations. They were abused, they were insulted, they were humiliated, and they put up with it because they loved being at these churches. They put up with it in part because they've been gaslighted by these pastors into thinking that, well, he's probably right and I'm probably wrong. Only the people behind closed doors know what some of these pastors are like. And I think the Apostle Paul, when he says, I know some people have preached for all the wrong motives, I'm just glad the gospel is being preached. So there's something to that, in that in a sense, the naked explanation of Scripture, the naked presentation of the gospel can change people. That's a big part of what I see going on.
I was one of those staff people in this church I was talking about. We would see a very different person in the office than the person that was portrayed from the pulpit. Everybody loved that pastor. He's just the sweetest person ever. But he was mean. He was spiteful. Basically, he was fearful and very insecure. Yeah. And so when you said gaslighting, oh my gosh, my first year, I was so gaslighted into thinking I was the worst pastor ever, because he was projecting onto me all his weaknesses. And you would say, I'm not going to mentor you. I'm not your friend. I'm your boss. So I'm going to send you somebody else, another pastor, another church to mentor you. I'm like, but I was a brand new pastor. Fresh out of seminary. I had no idea. I was naive. And so I'm thinking, a lot of these folks on these pastoral staffs, they don't know. They're trying their best, and they think,
that's right.
Oh, this is just the way it is. I guess I better suck it up, or something is wrong with me. I gotta submit. And he made us all sign documents that would say, I will totally submit to the authority of my senior pastor.
Yeah, this is fear. This is insecurity. This is narcissism. I mean, all these things rolled up into this. And, Bob, they're struggling in their own life, and they are able to combine the authority of God and Scripture with everything they say. I mean, on top of the fact that they can fire you, and they can get rid of you, and you're longing to experience your calling. And I agree that people behind closed doors, can see some of these behaviors, but an ability to know how to respond, a willingness to respond, the courage to respond are all involved in this. And one of the things that Laura and I are really grateful for about this book is it's given so many people language to describe their experience. And we're now discovering pastors are armed. This is no kidding. They're armed to respond to people who are using our book, or Diane Langberg's book, or Wade Mullen's book, or Rachel Den Hollander's book, who come in the office and say, I think you're gaslighting me. And they have responses. So they're already beginning to anticipate people bringing in these categories and deny them and suppress them. This is an alarming tendency. We have called out NDAs. We are learning that churches requiring people to sign NDAs in order to get hired. So that's sort of, Bob, what happened to you. You've got to sign these documents of loyalty in advance. And it means you're silenced about talking. And then what do? You're an island. You're afraid to talk to anybody else on staff for fear that they'll report you. No, boy.
In the church structure, there's no accountability because it's basically a single elder church.
That's right.
There's no other authorities. In the church that Brendan and I are talking about, it's basically there's a fiduciary board that's in charge of the money, and then there's the deacons who care for people, but there's no elders. And so these actual boards, they completely submit to the senior pastor and they defer to him and they think that he's right all the time. And so they can't get fired. I guess they can get thrown off the board, but they're just kind of, okay, if you say so, pastor, that must be the way it goes.
I've often said this, if that person that you're talking about with all that power wrapped up in their position is Tov, it's going to go well. If they're Tov. And you will never even notice the authority structures that are potentially dangerous. But the minute they begin to abuse their power, the authority structure is 100% in their favor, and there's nothing anybody can do. But I really worry about the papal structure of independent and Baptist churches.
And people would come to me after I planted the church, and they say, that pastor back in the old place, he's just an awful person. And I'm like, well, he's kind of creepy, yes. But the issue isn't just him. The issue is the way your church is organized, how it's structured.
Yeah, I agree, Bob.
Creating the problem. And until you fix that, and what you're saying, what you said about if you have a Tov pastor in that structure.
Yeah.
I interned under Newt Larson, who was the pastor of the chapel in Akron, which is this structure. I watched for a year the guy who is the celebrity pastor. I mean, he would do 30-minute spots on local TV with biblical nuggets. Everybody knew the face of Newt Larson. He was a beloved preacher. I mean, talk about a celebrity pastor, but he was the most servant attitude Tov pastor I've ever seen. He would pick up trash on his way into the building. He would, we'd do a staff lunch and he would be the one cleaning up afterwards. I think he purposely did those things to remind himself, I am nobody. I am not this superstar.
Well, that's what you got to have. I mean, those are the kinds of role models. And let's just assume that he didn't do those things to be seen. He did those things because that was his character. And if that's his character, he's going to produce a Tov culture around him, and people are going to be toved by being around him. They're gonna.
As a young man, I was just totally influenced by that. I'm like, if he can be that much of a servant, I'm going to be that much of a servant. Yeah. And I knew it was authentic because he was doing these things that nobody is watching. These
are sad stories to me, but I'm great. It's great to hear about Newt.
Brendan is contemplating going into vocational ministry. And so, he's like, should I do it? And I'm like, no, don't do it unless you have the proper reasons for doing it. You want to serve God. You want to be close to God. You want to be Christ-like so that you can help other people be Christ-like. That's the reason. I think when I went to TEDS, when you first saw me at Trinity, Scott, I wanted to find my significance as being a pastor. And that's scary when I look back at that. I'm like, what? And I think a lot of pastors think that if I'm preaching and people look up to me, then I have significance. I am important. And that's like the road to celebrity, isn't it?
It is, Bob. It is the path toward significance and stardom and being a hero Christian to other people. And I think at Trinity, we fostered the image of a pastor who was a celebrity Bible expositor. So we held up the role models of John Stott for his preaching, Martin Lloyd-Jones, I guess, for his preaching. I can't think of, there are some others that they brought in, and they were free church, but it was all about their ability to preach.
One of the reasons I went to Trinity is because Chuck Swindoll preached at a free church And so I was like, oh, Chuck Swindoll is my hero. I want to be him.
Yes. So I think there was a lot of that. And that is not a pastor. And it will foster superstar preachers who want to be somebody and known as a great preacher. And one of their goals is to be invited back to the seminary and preach in seminary chapel as a role model of what preaching is supposed to be. I think this distorts what pastoring is. And it turns people who are supposed to be pastors into machines who produce sermons and not much more. Now, fortunately, we had so many students who were so filled with the proper giftedness that when they became pastors, they really did pastor people, and preaching was important to them, but they didn't live for it. They could easily get by with not preaching every week. I mean, look at who we hold up as role models all the time. It's the people who are superstar pastors and preachers. And look, how many people did you have in your preaching classes at Trinity who have become superstar preachers? Zero? Because that would be the number. Very, very few people.
We all blame our New Testament professors.
That's right. It was Doug Moo's fault. It wasn't my fault. But there are very few people who are actually that good at preachers. And that's good.
Pastors aren't supposed to define themselves as preachers. They're supposed to define themselves as pastors. That's crazy talk.
I know.
What is a pastored shepherd supposed to be doing?
You see, I'm a fan of Eugene Peterson. A pastor is someone who is called to nurture the people of the church to which he or she is called into Christoformity, into Christ-likeness. And they are devoted to helping people become Christ-like. Preaching is one dimension of that. And it should be seen as no more, I'm just going to guess here, no more than a quarter of what they're doing. That is, only 25% of their task is preaching that sermon. The 75% is nurturing people into Christoformity in various ways. What are they doing with that 75% of their time, of their work?
Right.
I think this is what Eugene Peterson was striving to do. And Bob, I cannot tell you the number of pastors who have talked to me in the last 30 years who totally believe in Eugene Peterson in a world that wants Andy Stanleys and Rick Warrens. So their church wants superstar preacher,
right?
And they want to pastor people.
So
Brendan, but here's what I want to say to you. I don't know if Bob's told you this. The most important thing that you can do to work your way into a pastoral calling is to work with a Tov pastor and learn what it means to be a Tov pastor from someone who is Tov. That emulation is the heart of education. Information is superficial for education. You need a role model who can point you forward. Okay, so that's mine.
Oh, no, I completely agree with that. And I think part of why at this stage in my life I'm considering it is because of the wonderful pastoral mentors God's blessed me with. And I'm bold enough to even include Bob in that list.
Aw, shucks.
Yeah. No, I mean, it started.
Bob's from Ohio. He can't take a compliment.
No, I think part of how that was emulated, was with Bob. I met him during my undergrad. He was the campus minister to the commuter branch of Kent State that I went to. And I didn't really have a church home at that time. The community I was rooted in was the campus ministry. That was all I had. And so seeing how Bob took the time to pour into me, to meet with me with all of my, stupid 20-year-old guy questions and so forth as I was maturing and working through college. Like that was, I think, when I really started getting a passion to serve, was because I saw what that looked like from someone, I guess, serving me.
So, Brendan, what's your Venmo account number again? I need to send you that $50 for all that praise. That was really good. Thank you.
Bob, just rewrite the contract of this show so I can finally start getting my royalties.
Oh, I get royalties? This is really good.
No.
This is new.
I don't think that my motives right now for seeking vocational ministry are fame and affirmation and being a superstar, but like those things are inside of me somewhere, right? We all want to feel important.
Well, Chuck DeGroat told me he's got this good book called Narcissism Comes to Church. Chuck said every pastor, and then he said, and professors, he's a professor too, are on the narcissism spectrum. Nobody gets up in front of people and performs a sermon and speaks for God who doesn't have some ego strength. So it's insight into realizing that you have this tendency that will block you from becoming a full-blown narcissist. The narcissist doesn't realize they have these tendencies. They think everything they do is right, and anyone who opposes them slights them and offends them as someone who's attacking them. So that's what narcissists do. So if you're aware of your own weaknesses, you're not a narcissist. That's not what narcissists do. Now, you may have narcissistic leanings, and being a superstar and everybody bowing to you and doing whatever you want, treating you like you're God, can certainly make you worse and can affect your character toward toxicity. But if you're self-aware, maybe get a therapist and go through these things over and over, it's going to really help. Here I am, heading down the home stretch in my career, maybe 5 more years, maybe 10, I don't know. And it's really disappointing to me what's happened with pastoral leadership in the last, just in my career as an academic.
I have opportunities to preach, and every time I'm done preaching, I go to my wife and I said, I don't like doing that anymore like I did before. She's like, what do you mean? You loved to preach. And I know, but I just feel like it's just too much performance.
Yeah. It's a lot different than sitting over coffee and working with someone in their life. There's a big difference. And Bob, that's what happened to me when I went to North Park. I suddenly was a youth pastor. I'd never been that before.
Went to seminary to college, right?
Yeah, and then I didn't get to talk about the synopsis or redaction criticism. We're talking about Jesus, about students who were drunk the night before,
Right.
And it was a completely different life. And I learned to reduce the language and speak to where students were and to tailor my lectures for the room that was there, for the people in the room. And I did that for 17 years, and it transformed my life.
Well, thanks for being with us, Scott. I really appreciate it. Again, this book, it should have been written in 1997, but it's written in 2021, which is good.
2020.
In
2020. Came out in 2020.
Okay, 2020.
For some perspective, I was born in 1997, so.
That's the kind of perspective we do not like. So thanks, Scott, for being with us.
Bob, it's good to see you again. And I can never see you and not think of that heart surgery where we were praying for you when we were in Boston. Remember, that was something else.
Well, I mean, I was just sharing with Brendan that whole thing. And in my introduction, that's what I'm going to say about you is how you posted all of my wife's prayer requests on Jesus Creed, and people around the world were praying for me. That's right. I would go on Caring Bridge and I would read would come on Caring Bridge. I read about your story on Scot McKnight's blog and I'm praying for you. And this person is in Australia or something. It was crazy.
Yeah, that's right. So, okay. Well, thanks. And Brendan, good to meet you.
It's great meeting you, Scott.
And Northern Seminary is in your future.
There you go. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Reintegrate podcast. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, could you leave a rating and even maybe a short review? That will help others find this podcast. Be sure to go to re-integrate.org for links to more podcasts and online resources. You'll find the gateway to reading the Reintegrate blog that is stationed at the patheos.com website, the largest English language religion and spirituality site in the world. Also, you can find out how to get a copy of my Bible study, a book titled Reintegrate Your Vocation with God's Mission. All of that is at re-integrate.org. Remember the dash.